Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Matthew here. We're going to be talking about the great Matthew Henry today, especially his commentary, which practically every Christian in the English-speaking world has come into contact with at some point. My goodness, Matthew Henry's commentary has been used for over 300 years, greatly beloved. Practically every Bible software, every Bible searching application online has Matthew Henry's commentary for free because, of course, it's in the public domain, and it is something that Christians have used and loved for many, many years. Well, in this video, what we're going to do is actually talk about the background of Matthew Henry, which a lot less people know about. Interesting, isn't it, that we trust Matthew Henry's commentary, and yet we know so very little about the actual man? Who was Matthew Henry? Well, we're going to talk about that today in this video. What's up, everybody? My name is Matthew, one of the pastors at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed, Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, please come check us out. I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, right here in Pittsburgh. Come check us out, rpts.edu. Well, quick story for you. When I was in Bible college, we were learning how to write exegesis papers, and we had a pretty strong no Matthew Henry commentary rule in our class, and that is because our professor really wanted us to learn how to use technical exegetical commentaries. And Matthew Henry, while it's technical and it's exegetical, it's not modern in that sense. And so our professor was trying to do what he thought was right in steering us towards some of the more modern commentaries like the Word Biblical Commentary or the Pillar Series or the New International Critical Commentary. Those kinds of sets is what he really wanted us to delve into, academic, scholarly resources and such. But I'll tell you this, there's something of a bell curve as it relates to Matthew Henry, where your average Christian, even with no seminary, no Bible college training, will trust and use Matthew Henry. And then the academics, in the real kind of scholarly world, they kind of poo-poo Matthew Henry. But I'll tell you what, you come down the other side of that bell curve, and once again, you will realize that Matthew Henry's commentary is honestly second to none. There's very few commentaries that have been written in the history of the world that excel Matthew Henry, at least in the English-speaking world. Now, I could think of John Calvin's wonderful set, masterful set of commentaries as well. But in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about Matthew Henry. I want to take you into his background. In fact, what I want to do in this video is I want to share with you 20 facts about Matthew Henry, somewhat in a randomized order. So I'm not going to strictly go through Matthew Henry's life. But I do want to take you through the background of Matthew Henry, because I think what it'll do is help you appreciate the author of the commentaries a little bit more. And you might even decide, based on what I say in this video, whether or not you want to use Matthew Henry more or less. Personally, for me, having studied his life, I want to use his commentaries more than I already do because I like what I learned about Matthew Henry and his background. So here we go, straightway, forthwith, right into it, 20 facts about Matthew Henry's life. Okay, almost straight into it. I do want to mention, though, just a couple of sets of Matthew Henry's commentaries. Let me real quick do this. If you get the one volume unabridged, I just want to warn you that this is a behemoth, okay? And the font is very, 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 very small in this, so some people that grab this are maybe a little bit frustrated. Here's the set that I have. This is the one that I was about to show you on the screen right here. This is the multi-volume set, which you can get. And this is the one that I have and use on my desk. It's a little bit easier to read. I think it's in, 6 volumes. Yeah, so check that out if you're interested. By the way, I'm going to post links in the description of this video to every book that I mention, and I will be mentioning some other books as we go along. Okay, so number one, here we go. Matthew Henry, did you know this? He did not actually finish his commentary before he died. That's true. He had 13 friends of his finish from Romans through Revelations from his sermons and his extensive notes. Okay, so a lot of people, what they don't realize, especially if they're reading anything in the Bible from Romans through Revelation, you're not actually reading Matthew Henry. Well, you are, but it's sort of a filtered form of Matthew Henry, because what happened is he died. Obviously, his massive tome of commentaries is a huge, huge, huge work, which took him many, many years of writing these commentaries, and he died before he finished it up. So what happened is his friends, 13 of them, realizing what a massive, monumental work this was going to be, and certainly could be, they took all of his notes. He'd been preparing notes, and he'd been taking sermon notes and all these kinds of things for years and years in preparation to write the commentary. but they had to finish it for him. And so that's the first thing you need to know. If you're in anywhere from Romans to Revelation, please understand you're reading Matthew Henry as filtered through the writings of his 13 friends, which took his notes. Secondly, Matthew Henry interrupted the progress on his commentary to work on a book that he actually thought was more important than finishing his commentary, and that is his book, A Method for Prayer. So you can imagine that Matthew Henry was pretty captivated by this idea of writing a commentary over the whole course of the Bible, right? Well, he was, and it captured most of his adult, professional, scholarly, academic life. But he stopped at one point because he had another idea. He wrote this book right here called A Way to Pray, or A Method of Prayer. I really recommend this new one that just came out by Banner of Truth. It's edited by O. Palmer Robertson. I have this book at home. It's fantastic. And what Henry does is he gives you a volume of basic prayers, and he takes scripture and he turns them into prayers. So as you're praying these great prayers in this book, you're praying the scripture back to the Lord. And that was Matthew Henry's fundamental principle of how prayer should work. Henry thought that the scripture is filled with the promises of God, and in fact, of course, it is, and that it was best for the believer to pray those promises back to the Lord in terms of requests, and God would be sure to answer the kinds of prayers that he promises in his word. So I definitely recommend this book. It is fantastic. Number 3, Matthew Henry's father was also a Puritan pastor. He was expelled in 1661 from his pulpit for his nonconformity and refused to compromise his faith. So that's right. Matthew Henry, not only was he a PK, he was a pastor's kid, but his family had to endure some suffering, especially during the times of forced and compelled conformity in the Church of England. Of course, Matthew Henry is English. I should have mentioned that earlier. And during the 1600s, there's a great amount of tumult as the church is basically struggling, and the nation as a whole, the kingdom as a whole, I should say, struggling back and forth for who should have power to control the church. And as you probably know, Charles I, the great king, he wanted control over the church. The Puritans threw him out. Parliament threw him out. Thus, they had the Westminster Assembly, in which they went into a mode of something like Presbyterianism, a Puritan Presbyterianism for some time. And then there's the Restoration back of the second king, Charles II again, which once again wanted control over the churches. And there were times in which the true evangelical Puritans had to go into modes of nonconformity, meaning that they refused to comport with some of the king's compelled dictates, especially as it relates to church government and church worship. Well, Matthew Henry's father was one of those nonconformists, and in 1661, he was tossed out of his pulpit and basically had his church ripped out from underneath him. So Matthew Henry's father, at least in my view, something of a hero. Fourth, Matthew Henry was ordained privately by 6 Presbyterians. That's right. He would have been Presbyterian, but it was not possible in the Church of England at that time. So if you're wondering what denomination Matthew Henry was, well, we would say today, technically, he was a nonconformist. He was one of those Puritans who would not conform to the Church of England's dictates and commands at that time. However, had he had his preferences, he would have been Presbyterian, and he certainly makes Presbyterian arguments, especially theologically and exegetically from the scriptures. Okay, so he couldn't actually be a Presbyterian, and the reason is because Presbyterians require a presbyterial system of connection between churches. But inasmuch as he lived in a time in which the Church of England refused that setup, Henry could not actually be the denomination that he would have wanted. So that's why I like him. I'm a Presbyterian. Henry would have been. So there you go. Fifth, Matthew Henry's first charge was in a home church in Chester, England, which he successfully grew to some 350 people, and he pastored that church for 25 years. Now, again, I fully respect this. I think this is fantastic. Not only was he ordained by 6 Presbyterian ministers, but he basically started off in a home church. And again, remember, this is a time of nonconformity. So he's going to plant a church out of a home. And he was able to grow that church to 250 people. Eventually, they were able to build a building. He finally grew that church to about 350 people, which is wildly successful by almost any church planting standard. And he faithfully pastored that particular church for 25 years. We're going to come back to this church in Chester in just a little bit. But sixth, I also want to mention that during that time, he would preach in about 5 different field churches or other home churches for congregations that had no pastor. So again, during this time of forced conformity in the Church of England, a lot of your Puritan or nonconformist churches that had to gather together in small contexts, homes, barns, fields, etc., this kind of thing. And Henry, because he had a real pastor's heart, which again, this really endears him to me, he would go out and he would preach in a variety of other home churches or field churches, in as much as he wanted to see the gospel grow, even as he worked very patiently on his own home church in Chester. This is something that I greatly respect. So he's not just kind of an ivory tower theologian, but he's really a real preacher pastor who's doing the work of evangelism as far and as widely as he possibly could. Seventh, he did not begin his most famous work, the commentary, until he was 42 years old. Now, that's pretty interesting because you would think that writing an entire commentary on the whole Bible would basically demand and compel much or the entirety of one's life. Well, he was 42 years old when he started this. And so this is something of an encouragement, I think, for those of us who are maybe in those middle years to go after your dreams and your calling in the Lord. I'm 48 years old right now. Some of you are older than that. Some of you are younger than that. But I think it's interesting that he started his life's work in his 40s. Now, again, frame it up in context. People today, how long do they live? 75, 85 years? Not always so. Back in the 1600s, a lot of people died much earlier deaths due to disease and sanitary conditions, the inability to surger the body when it comes into real, gross forms of disease. They couldn't do those things back in those days. Hardly had anything that we would consider to be medicine today. And so to start something at age 42, like that could reasonably be towards the last years of your life, honestly speaking. But nevertheless, he felt a desire to do that. The Lord compelled him to do it, and he followed that call. I think that's awesome. Number 8, the great evangelist George Whitfield read his commentary almost every day, and John Wesley often caught Whitfield preaching Henry's outline several times. Now, this is kind of hilarious. All right, so a couple of dates here. 1714 is a date that you need to remember because that's the date that Henry died and the date that Whitfield was born. Okay, so they weren't contemporaries, but one generation later, right? So George Whitfield, the great revivalist, one of the most fantastic preachers in all of history, preached so many thousands of sermons over his life, often did not have time to prepare his sermons. So what did he do? Well, he read Henry's commentary every day, and so his sermons kind of started to sound like Matthew Henry's commentary. John Wesley, who's a friend of George Whitfield, often caught him preaching Henry's outlines in his commentary in sermonic form, which today, by today's standards, we would call that plagiarism. Okay, they did not have the kinds of plagiaristic standards as we do today. That's a little bit of a modern conformity. Certainly today, we would not want to be caught dead preaching another man's sermon, or at least citing him without naming our sources. You can do that. That's, of course, fine to do. But nevertheless, Wesley caught Whitfield preaching Matthew Henry's outlines at least several times. 9th, Matthew Henry was married twice. His first wife died. Her name was Catherine in childbirth. Sad, tragic story. And he remarried another woman named Mary. And of their 8 children, 3 died. Okay, so here's a life that is somewhat overcome by a great amount of suffering and pain and grief and loss. And this is true whenever you study virtually any one of the great divines in history. Go back through church history, pick any era, doesn't really matter, and you begin to study the lives of these men that the Lord used so wonderfully over the course of church history, and you'll find that they suffered greatly. A lot of them went through serious pain, either pain of body or pain of heart. And Matthew Henry had to suffer through the loss of his first wife dying as she was giving birth to children. And then even when he remarried by God's grace, 3 of their 8 children did end up succumbing to death. So we can see his heavy heart sometimes as he's writing in his commentary. Number 10, Matthew Henry left that church at Chester. Remember, we mentioned that church that he basically planted out of a living room earlier. And then he went on to pastor a very significant church in Hackney, London for the final chapter of his life. Okay, so at some point, and I'm not exactly sure why he left the Chester church. You would think because this was basically his life's work to pastor this congregation, that he would just stay there through the end of his life. But that's not what happened. He got called by a bigger church in the city of London, And who knows what his motivations are? I certainly would not impugn his motivations, but a lot of pastors in their lives, what happens is as they experience some success, there's a pull to something bigger or greater. That's not necessarily wrong. It can be. It's not necessarily, though. And in Henry's case, he did finally leave the church that he planted in order to go to London to pastor this much larger, and we might say by worldly standards at least, a more successful church. And that's where he spent his last few pastoral years. Okay? Number 11. Henry's commentaries often have his full-blown Calvinism removed or softened, especially in the abridged editions. So let the reader beware. Now, some of my viewers of this video, you're going to be like me, and you're essentially a Calvinist in your theology, which means you're Reformed. Maybe you subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith as I do, so Calvinistic by definition. Maybe you love the writings of people like Charles Spurgeon, who was also a Calvinist. But some people are not aware that Matthew Henry was a pretty ardent Calvinist in his theology. Okay, and maybe you haven't been aware of that because you've been reading an abridged version of his commentaries. And in the abridged versions of his commentaries, much of the later redactors or the editors weren't nearly as Calvinistic as Matthew Henry. So what did they do? They stripped it out. If you're going to abridge a great series of volumes and make them shorter, of course, by the editor's own decision, he or she is going to remove the parts that are least appealing or perceived to be the least relevant to that particular editor. So I do just want you to know that if you're not a Calvinist, that you might want to read some of the more abridged versions. If you are a Calvinist like me, then you're probably going to want to get the actual full unabridged versions so you can see what Matthew Henry actually believed and wrote about particular biblical texts. Number 12, and I just found this interesting. Matthew Henry was born a preemie, and he was physically frail for most of his childhood. Just kind of an interesting tidbit there. Number 13, Henry exhibited great genius as a child, and he learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew from a very young age. In fact, he read through the entire Bible for the first time at the age of 3 years old. Now, today, we look at some of these kinds of wonderful stories about these great men. Sometimes we elaborate these stories, and we call that hagiography, when you take a person from church history and you just extol them and tell how wonderful, how great, how genius they were. Yeah, but remember, yes, there's definitely that tendency to do that, no question. But remember, a lot of these men were great because they were, by God, extremely gifted. Matthew Henry did have a particular genius, and that genius showed up from a very early age. And by the way, being a person who was homeschooled by his father, a person who was taught the languages from a very early age, of course, he's going to be able to be a better, more acute, more detailed reader, especially when a person can read the languages in their biblical and original form. Now, I do want to take a moment here to just mention one of my partners on this YouTube channel, biblingo.org, is a wonderful way to learn the biblical languages. If you have a desire to learn biblical Greek or Hebrew, this is an awesome app. You can get it right on your phone. I'm going to post a link in the description of this video. If you want to learn the languages Greek and Hebrew, you don't have to go to seminary. You can. Certainly you should if you want to. That's one of the best ways to learn the languages. But if you can't go to seminary or Bible college and you want to learn Greek and Hebrew, biblingo.org is an awesome way to do that. Again, link in the description of this particular video. All right, next. 14. Matthew Henry loved and esteemed his father, and he wrote Philip Henry's biography. Now, I think this is fantastic. Not everybody loves their father. Not everybody has a great relationship with their dad. But Matthew Henry loved and respected his father, probably really respected his father. Remember, he was expelled from his pulpit, basically lost his church because of his nonconformity principles. Well, Henry obviously followed in his father's footsteps. He loved his father, and he respected him and revered him. And one of the books that he wrote, one of many, is his father's own biography. 15. Matthew Henry wrote 30 other books in addition to his commentary and his method of prayer. Now, a lot of people don't know that. That Matthew, you'd think, wouldn't you, that if you're going to spend your whole life writing a commentary on the entire Bible, that you wouldn't have time for much else. Well, Henry was cracking out a book a year, basically, if not more, during some of the most productive times of his life. And he's got a lot of other books about family devotions and other such things. Probably the two things that he's most known for are, of course, his commentary and his book Method of Prayer, both of which I do heartily recommend. 16. Matthew Henry stressed family devotions and wrote a book for fathers to lead their families entitled Family Hymns. Okay, so Henry believed, one of his convictions was that the home, especially the dinner table, ought to be a church. Not to replace the church, definitely not, but in supplement to the church, he believed that fathers should be leading their families and their wives and their children in prayer and regular devotion and Bible study. So he wrote several works to aid that calling, including his book, Family Hymns. Number 17, towards the end of his life, Matthew Henry fell from his horse and he died the next day in May 1714. So if you're wondering how Henry died, it was a fall. Probably a serious injury took place because the very next day he died. And when he died, this is interesting, number 18, he was buried in the chancel of his church in Chester, a common practice at that time. Now, I find this to be interesting because often I think about where I want to be buried. I don't know. Lived part of my life in Ohio, 31 years, part of my life in Florida, 11 years, part of my life now in Pennsylvania, 6 years. Where do I want to be buried? Well, Matthew Henry was buried in the chancel of that church that he founded back in Chester. They buried him under the pulpit. Now, this is something that they used to do back in those days. And I think, hey, let's revive that practice. You know, if you're a pastor of a particular church for 20, 30 years, why not be buried right underneath the pulpit, right? At least then your successor would always have your shadow looming over in terms of your reputation and your renown in that particular congregation. That might be a cool way to do it. Who knows? Well, I guess I thought I had 20 facts. I guess I only had 18. But nevertheless, I want to mention a couple of sources here, and then we'll be done for this particular video. You know, I mentioned the idea of plagiarism a while back, and that's certainly something we do not want to do as ministers or scholars or academics. And so I want to cite my sources. Everything that I just shared with you, I got from basically two books. Both of them are from Joel Beeke. Here is his book, Meet the Puritans, A Guide to Modern Reprints. And this is the book that I largely based this video on. You can read nice, short sketches of the Puritans' lives, including introductions to their main works. It's a wonderful book if you want to read usually about 10 to 12 pages on any given particular Puritan, who they are, where they lived, what they did, and what they wrote. So that's a good one. And then also this book right here, A Puritan Theology, Doctrine for Life. This is a systematic theology from the perspective of the Puritans, and there was one chapter on Matthew Henry, especially his prayer life, which I would recommend. The other book that I wanted to cite, remember, A Method of Prayer, edited by O. Palmer Robertson. Okay, so that's all I've got for you in this particular video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, you might want to check out Biblingo, again, if you're interested in learning the biblical languages of Greek or Hebrew. Or, how about this? If you just like my stuff, what I do, you kind of appreciate what I do, you might want to check out my book, Worshiptainment, The Modern Church's Golden Calf. I would love it and be very honored if you would grab one of my books on Amazon. Okay, that's it. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for checking in. As always, I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.